Kid of Arcadia, Chapter 20. Then I began to go under. On the bright days, the two of us would lie in the tall grass near the pond and watch the clouds roll on for hours. Overhead the sun appeared like a burning cross in my squint, and the grass bent over us like a church roof where we rested. Sometimes I'd hang on nothing but the rustle of the wind in the trees, played over my own breath until it was too hard to tell the two apart. I was no longer as hungry or enslaved to sex or otherwise craving this or that. The warm sun was enough of its own pleasure in the cool autumn air, and as if for the first time all over again. Ixie beer. Gus shook me from sleep with his singing. I say he really did have a nice singing voice, small like a child's whimper and meek, but not totally sissy-like either. He lay flat in the grass a few feet away, whispering to the sky. The wind picked up with it and blew a cloud over the sun, causing rays to poke out the gaps like some presence was reaching on down to earth through the shadows somewhere beyond the trees and the sprinkling of leaves. We didn't know the folks living over there on the hill, nor did we want to be like them or live the kinds of lives they did. They didn't help us. "What's that?" I asked him. "It's another word for God. Dad taught me it." "Your stepdad taught you that?" "Sounds like one of those weird things my dad used to say." "Was he good to you?" I asked, just trying to get him to talk about something other than God. "Yeah, he adopted me because he loved my mom." "Why were you taken away then?" I asked. He sighed. "It was my dog. I took good care of him, but he grew up and got different after a while. He never seemed so happy anymore. Then one day he just bit me out of the blue, and they told the school nothing about it, so it turned into this big thing. It wasn't his fault. It just happened." "Man, why'd they do that?" "They didn't think I should have had a dog. Then my stepdad lied to cover it up, and they got suspicious." I tucked my hands in the pockets of my windbreaker for warmth and flipped my shaggy hair out of my eyes. I don't know what caused me to break this silence next. Perhaps it was because of his story, but my brother was on my mind again. "It was my brother. For me," I said. "You have a brother?" he asked. 7 years old, almost 8 by now. He sighed. "I'm an only child." "So am I. He was my half-brother," I said. "What's that?" "My dad had another girlfriend besides my mom," I said. "Oh, well, you're lucky. I wish I had a brother," Gus said. It was the first time I'd ever heard anyone describe my situation with that kid as lucky. I gulped. I could have told him it was just about them seeing no reason to keep two disagreeable half-brothers together, but that hit me like an excuse. I still felt like it was my fault, and there was no reason to hold that truth back from Gus. Someone had to know the whole story about me, and he was more worthy to hear the truth than anyone I'd ever met. All he cared about was truth. It had always been, "Oh, poor Jared," since I was born. Nobody had ever called me lucky. They didn't want him around me when they took us. "He was so strong sometimes, I swear. He didn't even cry that night," I said, trying to swallow a dull ache forming in my throat. Then they said I was hurting him. "Were you?" "Yeah, it was my fault. I did things. But I was just angry and I just needed to talk to someone. That's all. This guy I used to know, Gus. This guy, he raped me. And stuff." I paused, waiting for his reaction, and then continued, feeling a little more comfortable. "Yeah, so anyways, I know what it's like. I didn't want to hurt him like that, but I did," I said. He didn't say a word. I don't know if he was shocked that I just spilled my guts like that, or if he really was wise enough to just stay quiet, but he obviously didn't see any reason to stop me, console me, or tell me I was wrong like so many others had done. There was no judgment coming from him, no questions, no punishments, no "I'm sorry," no guy rape jokes. Just an ounce of his peace and the whole of his attention. I took a few deep breaths and shook out of my despair with a long sigh. "It's okay. I forgive you," he said. Of all the things he could have said, that was just too much for me, and I had to escape. I stood and stormed off to the tent to lock myself in, just as Josh had done when he could no longer face the daylight. I fell down on my sleeping bag there, buried my face in the tiny rain-soaked pillow, and tried a few deep breaths like Mom had taught me, stretching my arms and legs out in the quilt. After a while of watching the shadows of the branches bounce up and down on the sides of the tent, it became clear they weren't the monsters my brain had been trying to convince me they were, and I understood why telling him upset me so much. I felt like I'd been looking into the darkness at the end of the bed all those years only to find out the monsters there were only shadows. It meant more coming from him because he knew it like I did. He knew how it was, about what keeping silent about something for so long can do to a person. I never figured out how he knew exactly, but it was the same feeling I had around Kelly. It was a kindred kind of feeling, like it just came off his skin or something, and yet he seemed to have found an answer through it. Gus made it sound too easy to forgive, but I still couldn't accept that I was forgivable. If you want to stop a shadow, you have to kill the sun, a voice sounded in my head. I lay there hugging my pillow and shaking my head. In my absence, the evening turned over and we eventually moved inside to catch our favorite broadcast. The next morning, I searched the house over for a pen, pulled out my old notebook, and half drowsily scribbled under the long-ago last entry dated in August, the only thing I could think to fill such a gap. October 21st, 1982. It's my birthday. I'm 13 now. I woke up and figured out I just spent the last 12 years dreaming. Gus and I are all that's left. I think he's right about everything. A day later, Gus was standing out in the pond, his pants rolled up, just swishing his feet around as he normally did to amuse himself. Crisp orange and yellows covered its surface. I was watching him from where I was by the rock. The sun was going down along the tree line, blazing bright yellow in my face, so I couldn't make out what his was doing behind the shadow of his hair. Suddenly, his silhouette just fell backwards in the water, smashing its flat reflection to bits and rapidly spreading out in all directions. I thought Gus had lost his balance, but then it just seemed like he'd lost his mind. He was splashing about for a minute in the water, laughing as he flopped around in the shallow splash, his blonde curls sticking over his eyes. What the fuck, man? I said, confused. You should come in, he replied. He sat up in the water and waved his hands as if I should join him, but I just smirked. We'd done that kind of stuff in the summer to cool off in the murky, stagnant pool, but that had already seemed like another lifetime ago. It was too chilly to get soaked now, and there was too much wind. But then again, I didn't want to see him alone out in it, looking like a jackass. Come on in, Jared, he said, sitting there staring at me, swishing his arms in it. Let's do it together. He was still trying to cheer me up, that's all it was. I hadn't even realized how much of a downer I'd been for those last few weeks until then, but apparently he had, and I didn't want to be a downer for him. He had enough things to be sad over without having to feel bad about my life story, that now, thanks to me, he knew all about. He knew I was damaged goods, a broken cup once held together with tape, and now not even that, a pile of shards. He knew everything, and I knew he was sad about it. Somehow, though, he refused to let it get him down. Come on, don't let me be wet alone, he said. He wasn't getting out until I joined him, and I couldn't just let him sit there by himself, so I puffed a sigh and stood, took off my coat, shoes, and socks, and tiptoed down to the chilly water over next to him, where it was up to my knees. I sat down in it, still sulking, so he told me to lean back into his arms and close my eyes, and I did. Then he lowered my back into the water. I clamped my eyes and felt a rush of cold murk pressing on every inch of my skin, even under my clothes. It was a flash in the dark. I gasped in the chill. It electrified my skin, something weird and wonderful. A cold shock to wake you up in the morning, kind of deal. A wow sensation that hits you with jolts from beyond, makes you chuckle, makes you gasp and lose control of your limbs in spasms. It was like lightning. I wasn't dumb to what this was and what he was doing, but I never knew just what it would feel like to actually do it. I could hear nothing under the water but the depths of my own body and the void around me. I could see nothing but black, So touch became everything. I guess you could say it was good touch this time. My legs kicked out from underneath me and I was now lying flat, almost floating in the murk and muddy shallows with only my ass weighing me down to the bottom. But then he quickly pulled me up and out, and it felt like pure suction. He was standing now and pulled me into a stand with him, and I was dripping wet, shocked and shivering, totally alive, energized and electrified. My hair matted over my eyes like his. "Whew! Yeah, that feels better," I shouted, shivering. "You are better," he replied. We both stood there splashing each other like goofy little kids for a few extra minutes before we finally decided it was getting too dark and cold, so we fled to the house. But I gotta tell you, something really did change that afternoon. The feeling didn't last forever because they never do. But that afternoon I was convinced that something had happened, that I was clean, that everything that had happened to me and everything I had done couldn't hurt me anymore, and was sitting somewhere in the shallow depths of that pond with the scum and the plants, covered up with a layer of orange leaves, dead forever. A fly buzzed around the room looking for an exit, and landed on my arm as I lay there on the living room floor prepping for the shoot. It was a week later and we had work to do that day. Though it tickled as it walked on me, I remained absolutely still. It washed its face and wiped its tiny arms over its bulbous eyes, and I wondered how much life it had left. "Well, hello there, Yar," I said, drunk, and it flew off. By the time the hour was up, the man was all set up and the two of us were stoned and drunk, stripped to our tidy whites and cracking up kissing each other in the midst of the white sheets spread out on the floor. We chuckled a few times getting it right, and at one point Gus even wrapped his arm around my shoulder like he meant it. I lowered him to the floor and tried to work my hands down his bare chest and crotch as the flashes on the camera caught us in another spotlight every 30 seconds sprawled in between our constant giggling. The blunt sure took the edge off with the beer cans we pounded back, so we were burping and giggling like brothers, but that's what our captor wanted. Made it easier to do and look more natural. Gus's cheeks always grew red and puffy when he toked, and I'm sure mine did too. We hadn't showered beforehand, but I couldn't smell anything over the pot smoke. We acted out a few positions for the buyer's fancy, while the fly buzzed around the scene watching us through it all. We were good actors. Gus always got the worst end of the act though, and between takes I noticed how put off he was by it. The creep had me slowly strip down to briefs and hold him by the hair. Then he moved us to the living room to finish it off with a rape mock-up. Gus had to make strained faces and claw at the carpet, and I had to grit my teeth and sneer in conquest or blow my mouth agape and clench my eyes shut in fake pleasure as I knelt behind his backside. It was only to the point that it looked like torture though, for he never felt any pain and I certainly never felt any pleasure. Loads of white glue and water were dripped on his face and chest and were carefully filmed. We were nude for that. I don't know whose hands those pictures ended up in, but whoever they were quite sick, far sicker than I'd ever dreamed anyone could be at that time. People would have had to be sick to think the stuff we were making was real when it was obviously just all one big lousy act. It disturbed and yet comforted me to know that there were fiercer monsters than me out there, but I still think some of it got to Gus's head. "Now that's some manly shit. They're gonna love it," our captor said while Gus was wiping the glue off his chest. I awoke in tears that next morning for some reason and washed them off in the sink. Every time I pushed myself to stay awake, I ended up dreaming so intense it left me losing breath and sobbing before I had even opened my eyes by daylight. There was no explanation. It came rushing on like I'd been hit with a tidal wave in the bed. Every muscle just lay in the sheets as my lungs ran my chest like a piston. Sometimes in the early morning when I had time to think on my own in the silence of the living room, my head was in a vice. I was always crying. So I turned to my video games. I relaxed on the rug every day, surrounded by pillows and blankets and with a joystick propped in my lap, trying to keep my mind occupied for so long the hours flew by in what seemed like minutes. I spent whole afternoons running from the maze dragons and collecting the keys in adventure to find that golden chalice and blew as many space rocks and ships to smithereens as I could in asteroids, the colorful home version. I outmaneuvered the Kotile's spiral attacks and built up for the Zorlon cannon in Yar's Revenge long into the night. Those games offered some escape, And as I zapped through level after level, I barely realized how fast the foliage changed outside. Everything was moving at such a clip around me, just as I was slowing down. It was a feeling I hadn't felt since I was little and trapped in the basement. Time became backwards. The small moments dragged, and the days and weeks joining them flew by. From the couch bed I watched the sunlight slowly grow deep blue in the evenings, cloudy and raining one day and lit the next. The rest of the world passed on in its hurry out there, all trying to get their hands on what Gus and I were experiencing just sitting there, wondering what to do with our time beyond playing video games, watching TV, and listening to the radio. Every night that creep came home, hung his coat, hat, and scarf on the rack in the hall, and boiled up some soup for 3, and we'd sit around the table in silence. "When I'm paid, you'll see just how much these girls will pay to have shots like that," the man said one night. "And then what?" I asked, annoyed with his lack of originality. Every week he promised something better was yet another week away. "What do you think?" he asked. "You know," I sneered, "you could just kill us if you didn't really want to pay us." "I don't go risking my neck every other day for no one. You'll get a bit of it when I feel like getting the spreads out. In the meantime, all you gotta do is be like pets and dick around the house. So what are you complaining about?" he said. "When's it gonna be my turn?" I asked, and Gus's face turned over white at just the suggestion. "A few weeks. They pay more if you make 'em wait. Trust me. Gets them impatient for more. But see, I can't force you to do anything here, because you'd find some way to screw me. I know, I've been blackmailed in the past. You guys can be quite cunning with the revenge. I've seen kids hide bills, break my cameras, prick themselves. That's what Josh used to do. You guys sometimes forget the story. That's when you gotta be reminded. That's the part I never liked doing." As I sat there listening to him speak with every nuance of manipulation, every perverted imagination of his, a worm wriggled in my gut. My chest burned, my hands shook, and I knew something had to give if I didn't get some fresh air fast. I stood up from the table without warning, stomped over to the door, and grabbed my windbreaker off the rack. "Where you going?" the man asked. "Does it matter?" I sneered, slipping into the armholes and reaching for the doorknob. "You coming back?" he asked. "Guess I got no choice," I shouted, slamming the kitchen door behind me. I stepped across the foyer, pushed out the screen door, and bounded down the steps, feeling the rush of chilled air on my cheeks. When I arrived at the street, I slowed my pace and contemplated which way I'd go. Down the hill meant traveling into town, and up meant venturing farther into the dark wilds of the woods, where the houses were scarce. All I needed was some peace and quiet and some time to think outside of that house for a change. The November air blasted me stiff. Long past the last of the streetlights, I threw myself down in the ditch on the side of the road and just lay there in the cold to stare at the stars overhead in the clear night. The trees on the other side were barely visible, and the only sound besides the gentle rumbling of the cars in the distance was the hissing of the wind grating through the empty branches and tossing stray leaves across the pavement. I stuck both hands deep in my pockets of my windbreaker and pulled my hood low on my forehead in the cold. Downhill the streetlights buzzed and blazed, casting shadows into the woods behind them, and wide glowing semicircles floating on the roadway. I could see the house lights shining warmly through the trees suspended in the shadows like orbs twinkling in the swaying branches. Uphill could have been a black abyss for all I knew, and even long after my eyes adjusted, it looked like the roadway just disappeared a few 100 feet farther into limitless space. If I dared venture on, I could have stepped off the end of the world and perhaps stopped all my troubles for good. Where else could I go? A few minutes passed and the cold wore tired on my nerves, so I only shivered when the gusts swept the hill. I stretched my legs in the mud and lay back on the ground where I could be comfortable. Some strange whistling arose in the distance, unfathomable to ear reach, like a child's laughter echoing from the forest. And I knew there was no way a kid could be enjoying themselves out in that cold dark. That child was nothing but a phantom, though, my imagination playing tricks on me, and I quickly lost the comfort and got spooked. The only place I could always find solace was in the constellations. The stars were an escape to heaven, almost hovering just out of reach. No matter how nervy the situation was down on Earth in those deep dark corners, the stars were always some means of escape. I wished I could have just run on down the road to greet my brother, take him back to that very spot and teach him all about the stars. There's so much a troubled kid like that can learn just by slowing down and being shown these things. In those restful moments, I also thought about my parents for the first time in months, like the last time I'd seen Mom, and wondered if she could have known if that long ago night that spring was the last time she'd see me for a very long time. That's when that same black pickup came crawling on up the street again. Its headlights spread their blinding light in all directions up the embankments, causing a rush of tree shadows to go spinning through the forests in either direction. How strange it seemed to be pacing, slow like the driver was searching the roadside. I actually felt anxious as it drew closer with its beams toward the abyss. Once it passed me, though, it sped off down the road, leaving a streak of light burned on my eyes. I still didn't think much of it, since there was no reason at the time to be worried about it, but I decided I better make my way back to the house to be safe. At some point I came under a humming streetlight and stood beneath its glow for a minute, almost unwilling to go the rest of the way. That's when the black pickup broke out in the darkness again, mysteriously heading back the way it had just come minutes earlier. When it saw me, it slowed to a crawl again, and I quickened my pace, trying to figure out what it was doing. I was hoping it would just speed on through again, but this time it didn't. The truck sputtered up beside me and the driver's window rolled down. "Hey kid, you live around here?" "Hey you, kid," the driver asked from behind the wheel, awash in the shadows. I didn't answer. I tucked my hands in my pockets and just continued plodding on, hoping he'd just go away. "Hey kid, I'm talking here. What are you doing sitting out in the woods like that? That don't look right," he said, letting his truck crawl down the slope. I shook my head and closed my eyes because I didn't want to end up in another police station or wherever this guy might have been taking this. I just hoped he wasn't a cop. But then again, I didn't care if he was. If he took me away that second or reported me later on, that would be it. The choice about whether to go back or not would once again no longer be up to me, and it would have been a load off. Even if going to the hall would have ruined what was left of my life. It wasn't even going back that scared me anymore. It was the thought of losing Gus or leaving him behind. In any case, I ignored this guy. "Whatever, kid," he said, and he pulled away at a faster push with the window still down. That's when I ran the rest of the way back to the house. I didn't tell anyone about encountering this stalker, because I didn't want to face the repercussions back at the house if our kidnapper got it in his head that someone was onto us, and I figured he deserved whatever he had coming. Once I made it up the side steps, that truck sped away. November 3rd, 1982. Dreamt that I was meant to have everything I wanted as a little kid, and now I just want everything I had then. Is that it? What's the plan, God? What do I do now? Are you up there? I'm waiting.
"Gus, what's a prayer anyways?" I asked him a few days later as we lay on the fold-out couch. It was one of those words my dad used to say, and one I hadn't heard anyone say like they meant it until I met Gus. I liked when people meant things. "It's just asking." "Why?" he said. We had spent the day as we always did by that point, all wrapped up in the blankets and comfortable by the orange glow of the space heater coils as we gamed, rested, and gave our praises for whatever we had there in the tiny room. Though it wasn't much, it contained at least our lives, and that was more than enough for both of us by then. I was curious now. I had always been taught that everything was all about me, so I guess I just wanted to know what else there was out there besides me. Gus seemed to have all the answers for me that day. "It's just one of those things my dad used to talk about, you know. He was all into that and stuff," I said, trying not to sound as interested as I was. "You know, it's just something different than you usually hear about, is all, I guess." "There's a lot of things like that," he said. "Like what?" I asked. "Like every day when I was sick, I said, God, if this is it, this is it. This is my cup, I guess." I said it just like that, and I felt better, even if I was still sick, he said. "Your cup?" I asked. "Just another way of saying being sick." "You made it up?"
After a deep breath, he patiently explained, "No, my dad and I used to say it before bed. Back then it meant other things, like me not getting taken away by the state." "So I guess father doesn't mean your dad, right?" I asked. "My dad is kind of like a father, because he adopted me. He cares about me when no one else does." "But what about God? He obviously didn't care, since you got taken away, unlike your stepdad, who still cares," I jabbed. "No, God cares too, even if you don't know what he's doing. You just ask him and things will happen how they should happen, and there's always something good about it. Sometimes I don't know why things happen, but I figure it out later." "So did God make you sick?" I asked. "I don't know, but sometimes you're better off being sick. It makes you think about things you can't change, like how you're gonna die. You can't change things like that. When you're dead, you'll never get sick again, so get it while you can," he said. "Because you'll be dead," I laughed. "No, we all live forever," he said. "Sorry, Gus, but you don't live after you're already dead, unless you're a zombie," I joked. "You'll live forever," he said, getting frustrated. "You sure about that?" I asked. "Just stop, please. We're alive, okay? Don't do what I did. Just go with whatever happens," he said. "You know, you're a little crazy, Gus," I joked. "That's what the doctor said." There he lay, soon fast asleep. I watched his chest rise and fall for a while, and it reminded me of the way Eliot used to curl up in a little ball in his bed around his spaceships and books. With both of them on my mind, I fell back on my side of the bed and fell in deep and long myself. Then the first thing I noticed when I stirred later that night was that I was all alone. The great daytime cold was replaced with a deep darkness as night had turned over and the entire house was plunged in shadow. I thought I saw Gus still resting before me in bed, but it was just the pillow he'd been clinging to that afternoon. So I rolled over and rose to my feet to peer around in the moonlight for any sign of life, all bug-eyed, and then tiptoed over toward the door to the bathroom. He must have been in there, I figured, for the door was closed and there was a light on under the door. So I tiptoed back to the fold-out couch and curled up on my side where my warm spot was. The remote was in reach on the nightstand, so I grabbed it and flipped on the television. It blinded me instantly in its glow, casting blue shadows all over every surface. The stations had all signed off for the night, and there was nothing but title cards and miles of static on every channel. So I shut it off, rolled over, and passed out again a few minutes later. After so many months sharing a tiny sleeping space with those two guys, doing it on my own was a new experience all over again. I just couldn't get comfortable that night, and nothing made sense when I woke. In fact, all that next morning I ended up searching in silence. I even raced out to our empty campsite in the cold and found no trace of him there either. The man had already gone to work. I dashed up and down the streets and all the forest paths, looking desperately for my friend and finding him nowhere. "Gus?" I shouted. My echo returned in the foliage. I searched every corner of that house to try to find his brown leather backpack or any of his clothes and saw nothing. My heart pounded and my eyes dodged around the room, fighting tears. A lump formed in my throat and my mind went through 1,000 different explanations. None of them gave me answers. Hours passed and Gus was just not showing up. I flipped over the nightstands and threw the lamps crashing on the carpet, letting them roll around caught by their cables. I ripped all the sheets off the bed and hurled them across the room, accidentally slicing my hand on the metal frame. And I cried, now bleeding, and cursed everything. Tears soaked my wintered cheeks as I stumbled off into the kitchen, where we all used to have breakfast. I kicked out the chairs to go banging down sideways, and turned over the table. The packed ashtray scattered its dust all over the linoleum floor. Then I fell to my knees and cast a glare at the ceiling. I could barely breathe. All my fingers tingled and froze. I slumped my shoulders forward and shut my eyes so tight all the muscles in my face could have snapped. Now I was alone.